so we are going to go ahead and get started, and hopefully you are in the right place at the right time. We're going to have some conversation about engaging students in the assessment process. This is part of our Learning Blitz that's put on by Wayne Risa, and we are that you are here and joining us today. The handouts for today's session can be found at the following URL, and I believe Michelle is going to the chat box here in a second, and so you can pull that up. There is a copy of the PowerPoint, a copy of several of the handouts that you're going to see examples of in the slides as we go through. So I want to make sure that everybody's able to get that. And there is that, there you go. There is that, everybody take a second and click on that link and open up that Google folder. Thank you, Michelle, for doing that for us. All right, so hopefully you've got that open and you have access to it. And let me just introduce myself very quickly. My name is Ellen Vorenkamp. I am an assessment consultant at Wayne Risa. I am starting my 14th year there at Wayne Risa, and I do pretty much all things assessment. But one of the things that I'm most passionate about is formative assessment and making sure that we are creating balanced assessment systems within our classrooms, and that we are making sure that our students are part of that process. So today's session is right up my alley, having this conversation around students and how we engage them in the teaching and learning and assessing process. So we want to remember, especially as we start the school year, that we want to think about the whole child. There are a lot of things that come to bear when we think about the kids and how they have made it through this past year and a half, and how they're coming back to us eager to learn and wanting to be, with their friends, but recognizing that we need to build those relationships with them, and we need to make sure that we attend to their needs and recognize that they have been through some trauma, and make sure that we hold steady in those aspects of their young lives. Recognizing that academics is very important, and it's not one or the other, it's the both and making sure that we come together and mutually reinforce what is best for students, and that we make sure that we hit on all of the different aspects of our students, the academics, of course, but also the physical, the character building, the cognitive demands, the metacognitive pieces, the emotional and the social pieces of our student learning. And when I think about assessment and how students react to assessment, and even the word assessment sometimes, I think it hits all of those different aspects. And so the more that we can help the students recognize that assessment is done with them and for them, and not necessarily to them, we can help mitigate some of the negative responses they might have in an emotional or a social or a physical sense. I also believe that formative assessment and assessment in general can be a tool for equity, and that through excellence we can build equitable educational systems, and that one of the most equitable things that we can do within our classroom is create a high quality balanced assessment system with high quality balanced assessment practices that we can put in place that become a pathway for all of our students to experience achievement, fairness, and opportunity in education. And we'll have some conversation around that, or you can, when you go into your breakout room, around some of these ideas that I'm sharing with you, and how those might resonate and how that might promote equity in your classrooms. So thank you for that, and let's get started. So here are our session outcomes. I basically have two. We have an hour and a half. It's going to be a quick ride. But I really am hoping that you recognize the need for student agency and really creating these assessment capable and assessment developed learners, and then examine some of those practices that do engage students in the assessment process, that do help them become agentic learners and develop their own sense of learning and how assessment fits into that picture. So before we get too deep, I want to just ask you a couple of questions. And so this is where your chat box comes into play. So the first question I'd like to ask you is, what does it mean in your world, when you think about an engaged learner? What does it mean to be an engaged learner? And if you could just go ahead, think about that for a minute, and then put your answer in the chat box, and then I will just read a couple. And if somebody strikes me, I may ask you to unmute and share your thinking around that. But I invite you also to look at everybody else's comments. And if you have any comment to make, respond to that person. What does it mean to be an engaged learner? Thank you, Carolyn. A student who is present in mind, not just in body, is reacting to the lesson, hopefully in a positive way, with interest, with questioning, recognizing what they know and don't know. Thank you. Somebody who is attentive, taking charge of their own learning, actively participating in the lesson like you guys are doing by putting in some thoughts, asking questions, responding to prompts, is actively seeking out information. I love it. Exploring concepts, inquiry-based, is able to explain what they are learning, maybe is able to teach it to a fellow student, is actually applying the information in a meaningful way, not just regurgitating, sitting there being a passive vessel. Excellent, thank you. Great responses. Okay, here's my next question. Why does it matter? Why does it matter if our students engaged, in particular in the assessment process? It's a big one right there, Michelle, self-reflection. Using the information from the evidence from those assessments to self-reflect, to think about where they're at, where they need to go, how they're going to close the gap for themselves, if they're using the right tools, if they're using the right learning strategies, if they're having any kind of student growth, if they're actually learning, right? All really important questions. I love that, Samantha. So they are able to see what they have learned and can make their own goals for growth. They can celebrate that. We talk a lot about student growth from a teacher point of view, but sometimes a little bit less from a student point of view, and how powerful it is for kids to actually see that growth themselves and be able to celebrate that. And I'm not talking about an A, I'm talking about really recognizing that they did something difficult and they were able to succeed on it, and they were able to come out the other end. And it might be a C, it might be a B, but it's growth, right? Because they were able to actually accomplish something and do something with them. If we don't use assessment to really help kids recognize that, we're missing a great opportunity. So I thought the first thing that we would probably need to do is come up with a shared definition of what learner agency is and why it is important. I think we had a lot of commonality in our responses there in the chat box, but I want to give you an expert's point of view. So this is what we call a learning point, and these learning points were created by the Assessment Learning Network, which is a division of the Michigan Assessment Consortium. This particular learning point was actually written by Jill Willis, who is a professor at a University of Queensland in Australia. And she came over to the United States a couple of years ago and did a workshop for the ALN. And as part of that, she wrote kind of a description about what it means to be a student who has that agency about them and is involved in that process and has that agentic quality of recognizing where they're at and where they need to go and how they're going to help themselves close the gap. So what I would like you to do is, in the Google folder, you have this handout, and I'm going to ask you to pull it up. It's a quick read. It's 2 pages front and back, but it's big type and there's a couple of big pictures in there too. So it's not a terribly long read for a Tuesday afternoon. There is also handout number 2, which I believe is the 3 A's protocol. And that particular is just, what do you agree with the author that might be saying in the article? What might you argue with them? What might you aspire to do? I can't remember exactly what the 3 A's are, but something like that. And I know it's very hard to write on that, if it's on your screen, but hopefully you have a piece of paper next to you and you can just jot down a couple of notes. We're done. We're going to go into a breakout room and you're going to share some of your insights with your colleagues within those breakout rooms. So I'm looking at my clock and it is 3:10. So I'm going to give you about 10 minutes to read this article. That will take us till 3:20. I'll give you a 2-minute warning and then a 1-minute warning. And then we will come back and go into some breakout rooms and discuss what you've read and how it's impacting your thinking around why we need students to be engaged in the assessment process. So if there aren't any questions, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box. I will be quiet, give you guys the opportunity to read. So at this point, we're going to put you into some breakout rooms. I think there are about 30 of us on the call, so I'm thinking there'll probably be about 3 to 4 in each of these breakout rooms. We're going to have you in there for about 9 minutes and then give you like a 1-minute warning to come back. If you filled out the 3 A's, you could read something that you aspire to, something that you agree with, or you could just share an important point that you had with one another, those within that article. Welcome back. I'm going to invite you, those of you that are back already, if there was something that just resonated with you, something you said, something you read, something somebody else said, just go ahead and put in the chat box anything that might have resonated with you from this article around learner agency, developing assessment capable learners. So welcome back, everybody. Thank you. We're inviting you to, in the chat box, if somebody said something that resonated with you, or something that you said that resonated with somebody else, or just something from the article that just sort of is there in your mind, if you would go ahead and just put that into the chat box as just kind of a quick review, that would be great. Thank you. You know, Samantha, you're really speaking to me today. This is one of my big things, is that emotional response that students have to assessment and how it can create kids who are really eager and really willing to learn because they're successful in assessment and they can play the game, so to speak, and they really know how to please the teacher in terms of those assessment related activities, and they really soar. And then we have, Rick Stiggins would call them the winners. And then we have those kids that Rick Stiggins would call the losers, you know, who really don't know how to play the game, that don't recognize that assessment can be a way to help them, but think of it as always a way to reiterate that they don't know, right? And how do we help kids recognize that an assessment is just an opportunity to do better? It's just evidence that we've gathered that will allow us then to move ourselves forward. And I think a lot of that has to do with the way that we as teachers approach assessment. If we make every assessment a test, then kids are going to have that feeling of being evaluated all of that time. However, if we make assessment more about gathering evidence of where you're at and where you need to go and use it to give feedback rather than a grade, that's a completely different experience. And kids recognize that they can make a mistake, recover from that mistake, learn from that mistake, move themselves forward. So really thinking about that emotional dynamic and what we want our assessments to do with our kids. Do we want it to stop the learning, or do we want it to continue the learning? And really thinking about how we're using assessments. When we think about the whole child, right? It's about all of that. Their cognitive, their academic, their emotional, and even the physical, because oftentimes kids will have physical reactions to tests that really get in the way and impede the way that we can figure out what they know and are able to do. Danielle, it's a great comment there. Thank you. Yeah, and I think what she's trying to say is that in her experience, it tends to be the teachers holding all the power, because many people do use assessment sort of as a, not all, but some use assessment kind of as a tool to potentially evaluate and judge. And we need to put that back into the hands of the kids. But that's an excellent point. I'm going to have to go back and reread that just a little bit more. Exemplars are important. We're going to talk about exemplars here in a few minutes. So thank you for that. The culture and climate within the classroom is key. Samantha Williams, again, thinking around how we promote that climate and that culture where mistakes are valued, learning is appreciated. It's not about learning it quick. It's about learning it well and learning it deeply and applying it in meaningful ways and using that assessment to help us do that. Setting up these routines for lifelong learners, right? Thank you, Linda. This is about these 21st century learning skills, about having, you know, critical thinkers and problem solvers and students who can recognize that the end is attainable, but it takes a little bit of work to get there. And it takes a lot of information and thinking about, I think about assessment pretty much as a GPS system. You know, we know what we want the end to be because we know what the state summative test is going to give or ask the kids. We know what our summative classroom assessments are going to give But all the assessment that we do, all the tasks that we have the students engaged in along the way, they're the GPS, right? They're letting us know if the students are on the right track, if they're getting off track, how do we redirect them? How do we help them redirect themselves so that they can get to that end result? So great conversation. I'm glad you read the article. I hope you found it helpful. Hopefully you can share it with some colleagues. I think there's a lot of good information in there. I wanted to show you next a TED Talk. And this is by a gentleman whose name is Eduardo Briceño. And some of you may know him. He's done some work around growth mindset and the work of Carol Dweck. This particular episode is more about the way that we set up our learning, and not necessarily always in a classroom setting, but in general, and how we have different zones. And he calls these zones learning zones and performance zones, and how oftentimes we spend too much time in the performance zone and we need to get more into the learning zone. And when you get into that learning zone, that's where assessment becomes part of something that is done with kids, not to kids. So I'm going to optimize and I'm going to mute, and we're going to see if this video works. It's usually about 50-50 with me about whether or not my technology works in this kind of a situation. But the video and the mouth might be a little bit different, but there are going to be subheadings down at the bottom that you should be able to read as we go. And hopefully this will work. This is kind of a little longer of a video. This is about 12 minutes. So, but it's an excellent video. It's going to be one you're going to want to share with your colleagues. So, all right, here we go.
Most of us go through life trying to do our best at whatever we do, whether it's our job, family, school, or anything else. I feel that way. I try my best. But some time ago, I came to a realization that I wasn't getting much better at the things I cared most about, whether it was being a husband, or a friend, or a professional or teammate. And I wasn't improving much at those things, even though I was spending a lot of time working hard at them. I've since realized from conversations I've had and from research that this stagnation, despite hard work, turns out to be pretty common. So I'd like to share with you some insights into why that is and what we can all do about it. What I've learned is that the most effective people and teams in any domain do something we can all emulate. They go through life deliberately alternating between two zones, the learning zone and the performance zone. The learning zone is when our goal is to improve. Then we do activities designed for improvement, concentrating on what we haven't mastered yet, which means we have to expect to make mistakes, knowing that we will learn from them. That is very different from what we do when we're in our performance zone, which is when our goal is to do something as best as we can, to execute. Then we concentrate on what we have already mastered and we try to minimize mistakes. Both of these zones should be part of our lives, but being clear about when we want to be in each of them, with what goal, focus, and expectations, helps us better perform and better improve. The performance zone maximizes our immediate performance, while the learning zone maximizes our growth and our future performance. The reason many of us don't improve much, despite our hard work, is that we tend to spend almost all of our time in the performance zone. This hinders our growth, and ironically, over the long term, also our performance. So what does the learning zone look like? Take Demosthenes, a political leader and the greatest orator and lawyer in ancient Greece. To become great, he didn't spend all his time just being an orator or a lawyer, which would be his performance zone, but instead he did activities designed for improvement. Of course, he studied a lot. He studied law and philosophy with guidance from mentors, but he also realized that being a lawyer involved persuading other people, so he also studied great speeches and acting. To get rid of an odd habit he had of involuntarily lifting his shoulder, he practiced his speeches in front of a mirror, and he suspended a sword from the ceiling so that if he raised his shoulder, it would hurt. To speak more clearly despite a lisp, he went through his speeches with stones in his mouth. He built an underground room where he could practice without interruptions and not disturb other people. And since courts at the time were very noisy, he also practiced by the ocean, projecting his voice above the roar of the waves. His activities in the learning zone were very different from his activities in court, his performance zone. In the learning zone, he did what Dr. Anders Ericsson calls deliberate practice. This involves breaking down abilities into component skills, being clear about what subskill we're working to improve, like keeping our shoulders down, giving full concentration to a high level of challenge outside our comfort zone, just beyond what we can currently do, using frequent feedback with repetition and adjustments, and ideally engaging the guidance of a skilled coach, because activities designed for improvement are domain-specific, and great teachers and coaches know what those activities are and can also give us expert feedback. It is this type of practice in the learning zone which leads to substantial improvement, not just time on task, performing. For example, research shows that after the first couple of years working in a profession, performance usually plateaus. This has been shown to be true in teaching, general medicine, nursing, and other fields. And it happens because once we think we've become good enough, adequate, then we stop spending time in the learning zone. We focus all our time on just doing our job, performing, which turns out not to be a great way to improve. But the people who continue to spend time in the learning zone do continue to always improve. The best salespeople, at least once a week, do activities with the goal of improvement. They read to extend their knowledge, consult with colleagues or domain experts, try out new strategies, solicit feedback, and reflect. The best chess players spend a lot of time not playing games of chess, which would be their performance zone, but trying to predict the moves grandmasters made and analyzing them. Each of us has probably spent many hours typing on a computer without getting faster. But if we spent 10 to 20 minutes each day fully concentrated on typing 10 to 20% faster than our current reliable speed, we would get faster, especially if we also identify what mistakes we're making and practice typing those words. That's deliberate practice. In what other parts of our lives, perhaps that we care more about, are we working hard but not improving much because we're always in the performance zone? Now, this is not to say that the performance zone has no value. It very much does. When I needed knee surgery, I didn't tell the surgeon, poke around in there and focus on what you don't know. We'll learn from your mistakes. I looked for a surgeon who I thought would do a good job, and I wanted her to do a good job. Being in the performance zone allows us to get things done as best as we can. It can also be motivating, and it provides us with information to identify what to focus on next when we go back to the learning zone. So the way to high performance is to alternate between the learning zone and the performance zone, purposefully building our skills in the learning zone, then applying those skills in the performance zone. When Beyoncé is on tour, during the concert, she's in her performance zone. But every night when she gets back to the hotel room, she goes right back into her learning zone. She watches a video of the show that just ended. She identifies opportunities for improvement for herself, her dancers, and her camera staff. And the next morning, everyone receives pages of notes with what to adjust, which they then work on during the day before the next performance. It's a spiral to ever-increasing capabilities, but we need to know when we seek to learn and when we seek to perform. And while we want to spend time doing both, the more time we spend in the learning zone, the more we'll improve. So how can we spend more time in the learning zone? First, we must believe and understand that we can improve, what we call a growth mindset. Second, we must want to improve at that particular skill. There has to be a purpose we care about, because it takes time and effort. Third, we must have an idea about how to improve, what we can do to improve. Not how I used to practice the guitar as a teenager, performing songs over and over again, but doing deliberate practice. And fourth, we must be in a low-stakes situation. Because if mistakes are to be expected, then the consequence of making them must not be catastrophic or even very significant. A tightrope walker doesn't practice new tricks without a net underneath, and an athlete wouldn't set out to first try a new move during a championship match. One reason that in our lives we spend so much time in the performance zone is that our environments often are unnecessarily high stakes. We create social risks for one another, even in schools which are supposed to be all about learning, and I'm not talking about standardized tests. I mean that every minute of every day, many students in elementary schools through colleges feel that if they make a mistake, others will think less of them. No wonder they're always stressed out and not taking the risks necessary for learning. But they learn that mistakes are undesirable inadvertently when teachers or parents are eager to hear just correct answers and reject mistakes rather than welcome and examine them to learn from them, or when we look for narrow responses rather than encourage more exploratory thinking that we can all learn from. When all homework or student work has a number or a letter on it and counts toward a final grade, rather than being used for practice, mistakes, feedback, and revision, we send the message that school is a performance zone. The same is true in our workplaces. In the companies I consult with, I often see flawless execution cultures, which leaders foster to encourage great work, but it leads employees to stay within what they know and not try new things, so companies struggle to innovate and improve, and they fall behind. We can create more spaces for growth by starting conversations with one another about when we want to be in each zone. What do we want to get better at and how? And when do we want to execute and minimize mistakes? That way we gain clarity about what success is, when, and how to best support one another. But what if we find ourselves in a chronic high-stakes setting and we feel we can't start those conversations yet? Then here are 3 things we can still do as individuals. First, we can create low-stakes islands in an otherwise high-stakes sea. These are spaces where mistakes have little consequence. For example, we might find a mentor or a trusted colleague with whom we can exchange ideas or have vulnerable conversations or even role play. Or we can ask for feedback-oriented meetings as projects progress. Or we can set aside time to read or watch videos or take online courses. Those are just some examples. Second, we can execute and perform as we're expected, but then reflect on what we could do better next time, like Beyoncé does, and we can observe and emulate experts. The observation, reflection, and adjustment is a learning zone. And finally, we can lead and lower the stakes for others by sharing what we want to get better at, by asking questions about what we don't know, by soliciting feedback, and by sharing our mistakes and what we've learned from them so that others can feel safe to do the same. Real confidence is about modeling ongoing learning. What if, instead of spending our lives doing, performing, we spent more time exploring, asking, listening, experimenting, reflecting, striving, and becoming? What if we each always had something we were working to improve? What if we created more low-stakes islands and waters? And what if we got clear within ourselves and with our teammates about when we seek to learn and when we seek to perform, so that our efforts can become more consequential, our improvement never ending, and our best even better? Thank you.
So much in that that video. I watched that video probably 100 times, and every time I just hear something else that just resonates with me and makes me think about how we could do things better, especially in the world of assessment. In the chat box, if you would like to share any thoughts. I love the piano music. I'm not sure where that's coming from.
I can see clearly now.
Oh.
The rain is gone.
I think that might be playing on the tab that
I
has
think
video.
that's my computer. It's like, oh, okay. How funny. Okay. Well, that was kind of an interesting little, maybe we can see more clearly now when we think about the learning zone versus the performance zone, and how test, performance zone, assessment, learning zone, and how we use assessment with our students. And yes, we are glad that the rain is gone and that the sun is out today. All right, we're going to move on because I really want to continue thinking about what Eduardo said. And the last couple of sentences in his TED Talk just really always resonate with me, and thinking about learners who are exploring, asking, listening, experimenting, reflecting, striving, becoming. Those are not students that are sitting at their desks Those are not students that are just waiting for the test to come around and, circle the correct answer or fill in the correct answer. These are kids who want to show us what they know in a variety of ways. These are kids who are striving to become assessment capable learners, who feel like they have some sort of value within that classroom and that they have a voice and that they can be involved in that teaching and learning and assessing process in a meaningful way, so that they feel as if this is something that is done with them and that we are building that community around them. So when we think about engaged learners within the assessment process, I think of 6 big buckets. I think of students who understand their learning path and are confident enough to take on the challenge. We think of students who are aware of their current level of understanding within that learning area and where they need to go next in order to improve. We recognize that these students are engaged, they seek feedback and recognize that errors are opportunities to learn. Students that are engaged in the assessment process select tools and resources to guide their own learning. They monitor their own progress and adjust course as needed, just like our GPS system. And they recognize that what they're learning and that they can teach others when that time comes. These are all from a book called Developing Assessment Capable Learners by John Hattie, Nancy Fry, and Doug Fisher. So if you're interested, that book has got some really great resources. I have kind of expanded on those. And what I'd like to do next is just look at each one of those 6 areas and give you some practices that we should see in the classroom that will help that particular bullet come true. So if we really want to understand and make sure that students understand their learning path, we have to have clarity. We have to seek clarity within our classrooms. And we have to make sure that we have very well articulated student-friendly learning goals, learning targets, call them what you want. Somewhere in that classroom, the students need to know why and what they are doing every day and what you expect out of that particular lesson in terms of them determining whether or not they're proficient. So learning goals and success criteria are essential. I know that in all of our observation tools, whether you use Danielson or whether you use Marzano or 5 Dimensions or Thoughtful Classrooms, everywhere in there they have something about learning targets, and they say that they should be posted on the board. That's not just for show. That's not just for compliance. That's not just to check a box and say, yep, it's done. It's because the research shows that when kids understand why they're engaged in a task, why they're engaged in a worksheet, while they're engaged in a project, why they're actually having a conversation with one of their peers, why they are completing whatever it is you have them completing, which is an assessment. Because every time you ask a question, every time you give the kids a worksheet, every time you observe them, you are assessing them to figure out what they know, what they don't know, what misconceptions they have, what gaps they might have, so on and so forth. The kids need to know why they're doing it and what you hope them to get out of it and what's going to look like in terms of success. So having student-friendly learning goals and being able to say, and this is what proficiency on that looks like, is key. I have been in some classrooms where the teacher will write that learning goal and success criteria on pretty much everything they give the students. If they give the kids a worksheet, the learning goal is there. So that when somebody comes in and they're asking questions, like maybe an administrator, and they sit down next to that child and they say, what are you learning or what are you doing? That child says, I'm learning how to do 2-digit multiplication by completing this worksheet and giving my teacher the evidence of whether or not I'm on the right track. Instead of that child saying, I'm completing a worksheet and I have no idea why, but I know I have to get it turned in or I'm going to get in trouble. Can you see the difference? Can you hear the difference? It's about the purpose and allowing kids to recognize what that purpose is. Learning goals, success criteria. Sometimes we have kids engaged in tasks that are a little bit more meaty and maybe sometimes a little bit more complicated. That's where exemplars come into play. Somebody had that in the chat box earlier. Exemplars are hugely important. I remember when I was teaching and I would sometimes have my kids write an essay. I don't recall ever actually finding a relevant essay from the real world and showing it to my kids so that they would actually have an example of what a real world life quality essay actually looked like. I wish I had done that more. I wish I had had that recognition, 20 years ago when I was back in the classroom to do that. Because if I want my kids to hit the target, I have to show them the target. I have to let them know what it looks like. I did use rubrics. Rubrics are another great way to share with students what it is that you want them to know and be able to do. Actually doing a workshop on rubrics coming up on the 24th. We're kind of having some different conversation around what rubrics can look like. You know, a lot of people think that you can go to rubicon.com and create a really well-developed rubric. Maybe not. They're not very easy to do really well, but they can be very powerful tools because they can give the students an idea of what it is you're looking for and what success on that looks like. Students have to have that growth mindset. They have to have the opportunity to make those mistakes and to recover from those mistakes. Mistakes are learning opportunities, and they have to have an environment within that classroom where those mistakes are valued, those mistakes are honored, those mistakes don't cause them to stay down and to get further and further behind and become depressed and to become physically ill because, you know, the first time they tried something, they were judged and they didn't do very well, and now they've given up in hopelessness. We have to have the opportunity to learn, and learning is a journey. And so we need to make sure that we have that climate within our classroom that really honors and promotes that growth mindset. And then we have to have some stamina and rigor. And so you might, and I'm going to explain that one in just a minute. So you might ask yourself, well, what does that look like? Well, it looks like this. It looks like kids sitting around with their teacher, having conversation around those learning goals and asking questions. Well, what does this really mean? And what does this look like in terms of the learning that we're doing in the classroom? And asking the teacher some questions and seeking clarification so that they truly understand what that looks like. It might mean using a handout that has the success criteria or that rubric that explains what the success criteria is, and maybe figuring out where they're at within that rubric and where they need to go next and beginning to set their own goals, or maybe working with their peers in terms of having some of those conversations. The exemplars and rubrics, we had some conversation around that. There's a great article out there. It's called Your Rubric is a Hot Mess. I don't know if any of you have read that. It's not in the folder. I should have put it in there, but maybe I will. I'll upload it maybe when we're done. It's a really great article that just talks about rubrics and how we just kind of mess them up sometimes. And there is actually a movement right now to do what we call single column rubrics or single point rubrics. So this is an example, and I know this is in the folder. What this is instead of trying to figure out what the shortcomings are, and then what the proficiency is, and then what above proficiency is, what they're saying now is if we could just figure out what is on a particular task and just put that in the middle column. And then when we give the students feedback, when we gather some evidence and we give them some feedback on where they're at in relation to that proficiency, in the left-hand column, we could give them some advice to make them move towards that proficiency. And in the right-hand column, if they're already at proficiency and went above and beyond, we can celebrate that with them and show them what they did that was actually more above and beyond. This is an example from Myron Dueck's book. He wrote a new book, just recently came out, Giving Students a Say. It was published back in 2021. I think it came out in January or February. And this is an example of what that looks like. You can see in the middle, he's got features of proficiency and what his proficiencies are. And then he's given the students some feedback in both of those columns. This is a great tool for students to use to self-reflect. You could have the students do this with one another and give peer feedback to one another, especially if you had a rubric that kind of explained examples of what some of that proficiency was, and the kids were able to compare. So it's an interesting tool. We're going to talk more about this if you want to join us on the 24th for that session that we're going to be doing around rubrics. The stamina and rigor. This is an interesting concept that came out of the book, the Developing Assessment Capable Learners book. And in this, what they talk about is Nancy Fry gives an example of how when she works out at the gym, sometimes she uses light weights and does a lot of reps because she wants to build her stamina. Other times she uses really heavy weights and just does a couple of reps because she wants to build up her strength or her rigor. It's the same thing within our classrooms. Every time we give the kids an assignment, we need to figure out where it fits within this quadrant, because we do want to have some productive struggle. We do want to have some strategic thinking. We do want to make sure that the kids are fluent in some things, but we also want to make sure that they have that resilience and that perseverance and that they follow through. So how often do we look at an assignment and say, wow, this is pretty simple, but it's going to take the kids a little bit of time to get it done. So it may be low in terms of the complexity, but it's high in terms of the stamina. Kids need that. They need to have some things that they have to follow through on, right? And make sure that they actually put in the time. Other times we have something that's very hard, but it's easy to get done, right? So it's high complexity, but it doesn't take much stamina. It can be done very quickly. It's just more difficult. We need to start thinking about that, and we need to recognize that and allow kids to know that this is going to be easy, but it's going to take us some time. This one's going to be a little bit more difficult, but it's going to get done quickly. And so we need to start thinking about how we create that balance in our classrooms and make sure that we provide students with all of those different types of assignments, and that we recognize it, because we need to build not only the rigor, but we need to build their stamina as well. If we can do that, then we truly will have students that are understanding their learning path and are confident enough to take on that challenge of what it is that we want them to know and be able to do. So that's number one. And I'm looking in the chat box to see if there are any comments, and I'm not seeing anything. So please, if you have anything you'd like to add, feel free to put it in the chat box. And I am going to give you a minute here in a few minutes. I think we do have one more breakout room if we have time, just to go in and kind of share some of these ideas. So the second one is that they are aware of their current level of understanding within a learning area. So this one, in this particular one, we talk about things like pre-assessment, giving kids the opportunity to self-assess, figuring out where they're at, where they need to go next, how they might close the gap. We can do this through conferencing and having conversations not only with our teacher, but with one another, gauging task difficulty, which is another one. And then of course, asking the right level of question to get at that right determination of whether or not the students are really on their way to understanding. So when I think of pre-assessment, you know, there's a difference between a pretest and a pre-assessment. I know that in our high school, sometimes we will take our final and we will give it to the kids as a pretest. And when we do that, we know that the kids are probably not going to do very well on it because they really haven't gotten that information. If they do, then they probably shouldn't be in the class, or we should definitely decide and differentiate instruction for kids who know what it is that we're getting ready to teach them. But sometimes we give that final as the pretest, and then we give the post-test at the end of the unit, and we use that for growth and whether or not the kids have grown. Pre-assessment is a little bit different. For me, pre-assessment really is narrowing down and maybe using something other than a multiple choice test to really determine what kids know and understand and how well they know and understand it. So maybe you have them do a journal, maybe you have them do a board blast, maybe you have them do a KWL, maybe you do something that gets really more at what prerequisites, skills might they have, what pieces might be missing, and where do you need to close the gap, especially on some of the skills and processes, not so much the content knowledge, but the skills and processes that you're going to be engaged in the unit that you might be preparing for. Either way, I think it's really important that we help kids recognize that that pre-assessment may be giving us information, but it's also giving them information. It's giving them information about what they know and what misconceptions they have, what gaps they might have in their learning. And as we go through the learning of that particular unit or the particular lessons that we're engaged in, bring those pre-assessments back out again every once in a while and let the kids go back and see what they now know and how much they have learned as they're going through the lessons and the activities and the tasks and the assessment pieces that you're engaging them in within the classroom. Because what promotes success better than recognizing that you've had some success and allowing kids to recognize that they have made some progress? And then it becomes more about their growth for themselves and less about us documenting growth for a teacher evaluation or some sort, but really does help grow our students. So think about how we use pre-assessment for the assessment process. Think about how we conference and how you're using conferencing with the students. And if it's targeted, if it's around the learning targets, if it's around the exemplars, if it's around maybe the pre-assessment itself, if it's around the evidence that you've collected around student understanding, How often do we give the kids a worksheet and actually give it back to them the next day and say, get with your partners and really talk about what's on here and what you got right and what you got wrong? Because I may have checked it, I didn't grade it, but I may have checked it, and compare your answers and come up with better answers or things like that. Instead of always just putting a grade on it, giving it back to them and going on to the next thing. Really using these tools, these evidence tools in a meaningful way for students to make meaning of and to really conference with one another. Task difficulty is an interesting one. In this particular piece, what they say is it's really important for kids and for us to recognize how kids feel about some of these assessments that we're giving them. So before I was telling you about the task, the stamina and rigor. So potentially you're giving something to the students that's really high difficulty, but easy to do. And maybe you have them look at that first and you actually ask them, how difficult do you think it's going to be for you to complete this task? And maybe give them something that looks like this with a very difficult, smiley face or a frowny face. Or, this is probably a very elementary-ish one. Maybe there's, you could change it. I just made this up really quick. You could change this into something that's more conducive to a middle school or a secondary. But really have some conversations with the child. If you find something that you think the kids should be relatively easy, it may take them a little long to do it, but it's relatively easy, and you have a child that thinks it's going to be very difficult, there's a conversation. Why do you think this is going to be so hard? How can I help you break this down so that this becomes something doable? Oftentimes, kids don't provide us evidence of their learning. Some people would say complete homework. I would like to say provide evidence of learning, because they just get overwhelmed. And something that we think is going to be very easy for them to do becomes a stumbling block or becomes, an elephant in the room. And sometimes they just have to recognize it. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? And having those conversations could go the other way as well. If you have something that you think is relatively difficult and a child thinks it's going to be very easy, well, let's have that conversation too, because you don't want it done just sort of, willy-nilly. You want it done the way it needs to be done, like the exemplar is saying. And so we need to have the conversation with the child to make sure that they understand that this isn't going to be quite as easy as they might think, and let's have that conversation as well. So gauging task difficulty is another way to help us find out and let kids recognize where they're at and where they need to go. And will give us a little bit better understanding in terms of their current level of understanding around the content that we are teaching them at that moment. Questions. The questions that the teachers ask are huge. And really having that conversation and really making sure that we are using questions that go at all levels of Bloom's taxonomy. This particular teacher, I'm not going to show you this video, but she engages in some of the best questions. And actually, some of her best questions aren't questions at all. She just will say things like, tell me more. What do you, just tell me more. What a great question. What convinces you? How can you convince me? How did you come up with that? Just really great statements, really great comments that really get at students thinking. One of the reasons that it's easy to give feedback in things like football or basketball is because you can see the kids doing it. You can see their actions. You can see them dribbling, or you can see them not standing correctly when they're getting ready to throw the ball, that kind of stuff. It's much harder when they're solving a math problem or coming up with a scientific notation or trying to comprehend from a reading, because you can't really see in their brains. And the only way that we can start really trying to understand what's going on in there is through the questions that we ask and making sure that we are asking those questions. I do like this Bloom's taxonomy, critical thinking skills, because it does give us some sentence starters that get us to the different levels of Bloom's taxonomy. And so that we recognize that we are asking questions that are worth asking, that they're not just those simple recall one-word answers, correct yes or no, but they are questions that are really getting kids to think and to dive deeper into that content and really have to apply that information that we're asking about in meaningful ways. I have seen teachers take this and just use it in a multitude of ways, and then actually give it to their kids and challenge the kids to start asking the teachers questions that are a little bit more challenging and not just those simple recall and factual type of questions. So I think that can be a really nice tool. And if you Google Bloom's taxonomy questions, there's probably hundreds of these online. that you could find. This is just one example that I found. One thing that I do find too is that as teachers, we need to identify the types of questions that we're asking. So when you do ask a question, you could say something like, okay, now I'm going to ask you an evaluation question, so that kids start to recognize that there are varying levels. Well, now I need you to synthesize. So I'm going to ask you this question, and then I need it. And then when they get to assessments or tests like the SAT or the SAT, and they see some of those questions, they recognize that those are, you know, a little bit deeper, not necessarily more difficult, but sometimes a little bit deeper in terms of the thinking and the cognitive demand. So identifying the types of questions you're asking can be very powerful. So I think at this point, Michelle, if it's okay, I think we'd like to go into a quick breakout room, maybe just about 5 minutes. Let's drop them into and I just want you to think about anything that I've said up to this point. I see a couple of people that have added some things about things that they have been doing and how they're practicing some of this stuff. I think this would be a great opportunity for you to share some of these ideas. So it is about 10 after. So let's just do 5 minutes. Let's just do a quick 5-minute breakout room where you can share. So 4 minutes and then a 1-minute warning to come back. Does that sound okay? All right, welcome back. All right, I think that's all of us. So we're gonna go through these next pieces, and this one is probably my favorite. This is all about the learning zone, right? This is all about the feedback and using assessment. And you know that you've really arrived when you actually have students asking you for feedback. This is what I've done. This is where I think I'm at. This is what I think I see in the rubric. Can you give me just a little bit of feedback to see, you know, where I go next? So when students can actually seek and then use that feedback in a meaningful way, that's when they're starting to become assessment capable learners. We need to make sure that our feedback is descriptive and actionable. This is what you've done well. This is where you need to go to next. Just like your GPS system. You made it this far. Now you took a wrong turn. You got to go back, you know, so that you can get to your destination. So descriptive and actionable. Good job is not descriptive and actionable. B+ is not descriptive and actionable. It's got to tell them in relation to the actual standard, what they've done well and what they need to do next. It's not just related to the tasks. Sometimes you have to talk to them about the behaviors and the cognition pieces, if they use the right tool, if they've used the right process. So sometimes when we think about feedback, you could talk to them about time management. You could talk to them about if they use the right strategy, if they maybe need to modify that strategy the next time so that their outcome might be better. So it's not just about, you know, the content, but it's about how they arrived at that content and some of the processes and cognitive pieces that come into play as well. So feedback is pretty broad. We also have to make sure that kids get the opportunity to use the feedback, because you can give them all the feedback you want, but if you don't give them the time to reflect on that feedback, then you're just wasting your time. And that reflection process is part of the assessment piece, and it is part of the learning. I think it was John Dewey who said, we don't learn from our experiences, we learn from reflecting on our experiences. And so giving the students that opportunity. And then ultimately you will get to where the students are asking for that feedback. This is a poster that is hanging in one of the schools. And every day they ask the kids, did you offer help to somebody? Did you offer to give somebody some feedback? Did you ask for feedback when you needed feedback? Did you accept the feedback? And if so, why? And how did it help you? But oftentimes too, we'll want to say, did you nicely decline? Because sometimes we do want the kids to struggle. And if somebody's offering them feedback, maybe it's too early, or maybe they don't quite want it yet, and they want that opportunity to try themselves. So they might decline that offer in terms of that feedback and work on their own. Remember that the purpose of feedback is about nudging. It's about nudging kids along. It's not about judging. That's what we do when we grade. Feedback is all about nudging and giving kids that gentle push to take them to that next level of learning. So this is what it might look like, sitting down next to each other and having that student explain to you what they've done, and then asking you for some feedback. It might look like something like this. This is something that this teacher was doing online, where he was giving some feedback around process and whether or not the kids were following the directions by color coding certain things. It might look like conversations. It might look like observations. Feedback is big. We do a lot of workshops at RISA around feedback. So, and we've created a lot of resources. So my email is on this PowerPoint towards the end. If you need anything around that, just let me know. The next one is they can select tools and resources to guide their learning. So one of the things that they talk about in this particular strand is that we make our teaching moves very apparent. Every strategy that we use as a teacher might be a strategy that the tool or a strategy that students could use. And we need to make sure that we're very, very open and upfront with those different strategies. So like right now I'm modeling, and this is how I model, and you might be able to model and you know, by yourself, you might be able to, you know, talk it out in your own head, you know, as you're trying to solve these problems at home. Anything you do in terms of as a strategy in terms of teaching and getting information across to your students might be a strategy that they might be able to use. Goal setting is huge, and goal setting is not kids sitting down at the beginning of the semester and saying, I'm going to make an A at the end. That's not a goal. The goal is looking at your pre-assessment and having some conversation, or looking at your first attempt at something and then looking at the rubric and saying, okay, next time I try this, I just want to make sure that I can do this. And it's a bite-sized little chunk that's going to take you forward one step at a time. We don't need these big, you know, I'm going to make an A with no idea on how to actually get that. And that's really not the end goal. The end goal isn't the grade. The end goal is I can actually create an essay, or the end goal is I can actually, you know, do this scientific experiment and write my lab report and really explain what I've done, or I can create this project. One of the things that we also need to start doing a little bit more of is teaching kids study skills, teaching them how to take notes, some of the cognitive demands, teaching them how to summarize, how to be metacognitive and think about their thinking and thinking about their self-regulation and how that's impacting their learning, or standing in the way, or what obstacles they might be putting up for themselves just by not being aware of that self-regulation in their behaviors. And then that affective, their motivation, and why are they doing this, and what's their real purpose, and really connecting with kids in terms of that affective piece. I used to do study skills quite a bit when I was in school, and I think it's kind of fallen off. I think after Common Core, we got so busy at the Common Core stuff that we haven't done as much study skills anymore. And I'm only saying that because my own children, I didn't see a whole lot of study skills with them as they went through middle school and high school. And once they got to college, I think they may have suffered for it. So thinking about how we might engage kids in some of those study skills, I think are some really great tools and resources that they might be able to use. And then kids asking questions, not the teachers asking the questions, but teaching the kids to ask those questions so that they can start to narrow down some of their thinking and their ideas and clarify and probe and become better in terms of their learning. So the Quaglia Institute talks a lot about helping kids find their voice and using their voices. Students are 3 times more likely to experience self-worth in school, 5 times more likely to be engaged, and 5 times more likely to have a sense of purpose when we just ask them some questions and give them the opportunity to share their voice in terms of what works for them, what doesn't work for them, how well they think they're doing, what goal they might want to set. So I think actually choice and voice in terms of assessment are huge. And that Quaglia Institute's got some interesting information. You might want to check it out. Graphic organizers, I think, are really important. They can be used in terms of content, but they can also be used for metacognitive and behavior and self-regulation. There's a lot of different graphic organizers, and there's a website there that you could visit that's got some really nice ones. The study skills, again, I think I already talked about that, the different cognitive, the metacognitive, and then the affective study skills. And that also comes from the book, the Developing Assessment Capable Learners. And then this is a great organization. It's called the Right Question Institute, and you can go to rightquestion.org. And they have a whole process that you can engage in. It's a whole workshop that you can engage your faculty and staff and yourself and your students in how to actually ask questions and formulate really good questions around a particular topic that you might be engaging in an upcoming unit or in an upcoming lesson. So I would encourage you to look at all of those resources, because all of them will help us develop kids who are assessment capable and are able to use tools and resources to help move themselves along within that learning zone. All right, we got 2 more and we're getting kind of short on time, but I have about 7 minutes. I think we're going to be just perfect. Self-assessment is huge. You know, I said earlier, John Dewey talked a little bit about, you know, we don't learn from our experiences, we learn from reflecting, and really giving the students that opportunity. I know very few kids, myself included and my children included, they would get on a bus on the way home from school and would reflect on their day and what worked and what didn't work. We need to give them time in the classroom to do that. We need to give them the evidence that we've collected. We need to give it back to them. We need them to have the opportunity to reflect. And notice that I keep saying evidence. I have found that if we stop calling it homework and we just call it evidence, I need your evidence. Today, you're going to give me some evidence on whether or not you can do whatever. And kids begin to recognize, oh, she needs this, because if she doesn't have that evidence, then she doesn't know where I am, and then she doesn't know where to put me when we get into groups tomorrow. And because everybody will say, well, if you don't grade it, the kids won't do it. Well, they will if they know that you're using that evidence to make decisions about what they're learning and when they're learning and how they're learning and what comes next in their learning. And it's just a matter of how you talk about it with them and how you explain that I'm not having you do this worksheet, or I'm not having you read this and answer questions because I need to give you a grade. I'm gathering this evidence because I need to know what you understand and what you don't understand and where we need to go next in your learning. It's a completely different mindset. But we do need kids who are self-assessing. We need students who are looking at their own growth in relation to those learning goals or learning targets and the success criteria. We need kids that are keeping their own data notebooks. I am not a big fan of data walls. I think data walls punish kids. I think they embarrass kids, but I think kids who keep their own data notebooks and are able to track their own progress, I think that is a very powerful tool. We need kids who are problem solvers and critical thinkers and that reflect. This is one self-assessment example that I have seen in a classroom where the teacher just has these boxes, and at the end she'll have them just put their names on a particular topic that they have just been learning, and the kids kind of self-assess themselves as to where they think they're at. She'll take those up, and the next day, all of those that I'm just learning, she'll put them together with somebody who thinks they're a pro, and they will, you know, do some learning together. And then maybe she'll take the number 2s and maybe she has some conversation with them, and she's got the 3s doing, you know, she's able to differentiate the next day based on how the kids have determined what they know or what they don't know through those exit levels. Monitoring their own progress, data notebooks, all kinds of data notebooks. I have a couple of examples. If you email me, I can show those to you. There are websites galore. Leader in Me has got all kinds of information around data notebooks and what those might look like. When we think about problem solving and thinking critically, David Conley out of the University of Oregon has got some really great ideas in terms of what that would look like. And he says really that when we think about priority standards or power standards, there are really 6 of them, and these are the 6. That we should really be teaching kids to read analytically and discuss analytically, that we should be teaching them persuasive writing. We should be helping them recognize how to draw inferences and conclusions from texts. They should be analyzing conflicting source documents. They should be supporting arguments with evidence, and they should be solving complex problems with no obvious answers. And whatever content you happen to be teaching, if you can get kids engaged in these processes and these critical thinking strategies, then you are doing what you need to do in order to get kids involved in the assessment process and to create agentic learners and to create 21st century learners. So look up David Conley, University of Oregon. You can just look on his website. He's got a lot of information. I think I've already shared this with you. We don't learn from our experience. We learn from reflecting on our experience. That's kind of my motto. As soon as we get done here, I'm going to reflect on my time management and whether or not I got this done, or if I spent too much time with the video and not enough time with some of these strategies as we, you know, get and wind down here at almost 4:30. The flip side of self-assessing is peer assessing. So we want kids to be able to self-assess and keep themselves in the moment, take these strategies that we're teaching them and use them at home when they happen to be alone. But we also want them to be resources for one another in our classroom. If you have a classroom of 30 students, there should not be one teacher in that classroom. There should be 31 teachers in that classroom. And using peers as resources for one another can be very powerful. So peer assessment, allowing for collaboration, having the shared understanding of what this looks like and what it takes, and then having the shared responsibility of holding everybody accountable and making sure that everybody is doing that. So it might look at like something like this, giving each other advice and suggestions on where to go next, descriptive and actionable feedback to one another based on the success criteria, looking at the evidence that you produce, and then helping each other get better and accomplish those goals that you might set. This is an example of two little boys who read to each other, and they gave each other feedback, and they were talking about how, well, you read very clearly, you enunciated really good. Your voice got very excited when you were reading the part about the boy, and he got excited. And at the end, they always asked each other, do you understand my feedback? Was there something else I could have said to you that would have helped you? I mean, these kids have been taught that feedback and how to do this. Self and peer feedback don't happen naturally. It's something that has to be taught, especially in content areas. It actually does come naturally out on the playground when they're playing Foursquare or when they're playing jump rope or when they're doing something. But sometimes in the classroom, we have to model this for our students and really give them that opportunity to practice. I was going to put you into breakout rooms again, but we don't have time. So I am just going to ask in the chat box if there was anything that just resonated with you within that last section around the feedback piece, around monitoring their own progress, being self-assessors, maybe looking at the questioning strategies of the students, anything like that that might just pop into your brain that you'd like to share out. And I've seen some already. The Leader in Me is a very powerful program because it does create not just assessment capable learners, but just capable learners in general. The students who are just really involved in their learning and wanting to know more. We are at the end, but I am interested if anybody would like to stay on, and if you have any questions or thoughts or concerns, if there's anything in the chat box, I see some people are putting some stuff in there. And so maybe you can just take a minute and share with one another through reading some of those suggestions. We've created a community here and you guys have a lot to share, and I'd like that. So, but those of you that need to go because it's 4:30, I recognize that as well. That is my name, that is my phone number, and that is my email address. And if you have any questions or would like any further information, please feel free to contact me. And that Google folder will be open for a while, so you'll have access to some of this. And I'd like to thank you. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.